Hi there and welcome to Belfast High School History Department on YouTube. This little video is going to look at the key topic of why Prohibition failed in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. This great Noble Experiment was very famous for actually failing, and it's the first time in American history that an amendment has actually had to be reversed. So let's look at the reasons why. Well, the first reason you could possibly give for the ending of Prohibition was that it was unenforceable and it was unworkable. This great Noble Experiment, as it was called, had lots and lots of things that made it unworkable as well. So people quickly found loopholes. For example, vineyards in California that had been used to obviously growing grapes for wine, they quickly changed the system whereby they actually supplied dried grape blocks, and they had warnings on these here to say, look, if you actually leave this overnight with water, there's a danger it might turn into alcohol, to be very aware of this. Of course, that's what they're being sold for. People were actually buying these and actually turning them into alcohol themselves. You also had an allowance that was set up, so if you already had alcohol stockpiled, you were allowed to keep that. So lots of wealthy people just kept vast cellars of alcohol, which they could then use throughout the 1920s and 30s. You had loopholes as well for example, religious ceremonies. Sacramental wine was allowed to be retained. So obviously church ceremonies were highly popular around this time. You had medical access as well. Over 6 million new prescriptions were issued during the 1920s and 30s, and you get 1 pint of alcohol for the very sick. You had cordial bars. That cordial bars would appear to sell lemonade. In reality, there was alcohol within them. And then whenever you aren't able to get something, well, sometimes what happens is people learn to make this themselves. So they actually started to use stills to distill alcohol from things like potatoes, and they produced their own moonshine. This is very popular, but you have to be very aware as well that thousands of people would actually die during the 1920s by being poisoned by the alcohol content of some of the moonshine that they were consuming. You also had an absolute boom in speakeasies. While bars and pubs were being closed down across America, you obviously had these just getting pushed underground. So you had a vast number of speakeasies, as they were called, emerging during this time. So over 250,000. There was actually more speakeasies than there were bars before Prohibition. It seems ridiculous, but that's exactly the case. So these types of things really did undermine Prohibition from the very start. You would also have other reasons as well too. So next is ineffective policing. So you did have this brand new law, but that law was not enforced in any meaningful way by the government. You started to get very quickly bootlegging taking place. Now, bootlegging goes way back, where people would actually have little bits of alcohol in a flask inside their boot, and they would actually sell this here to people in states that actually had Prohibition before it was actually across the whole United States. And that was like the ability to actually smuggle and produce alcohol in vast big businesses across the United States. So people would smuggle it in, they would bootleg it in from America's vast borders into the United States, from Mexico, from Canada, from Bahamas. Very lucrative. You would have the likes of the real McCoy, who made their money by bringing in alcohol from the likes of Bahamas into Florida. It would cost about $15,000 a crossing, and he was very famous for smuggling in Scotch, and that's what the term the real McCoy would actually come from. What about the police then? Well, the police were vastly under-resourced during this time. The bootleggers were making lots and lots of money. One policeman who actually went into bootlegging himself actually made so much money that it was worth 2 years' wages in 1 week as a policeman. So he's making lots and lots of money. So very under-resourced, very low numbers. They only had 1,500 policemen to cover the whole United States. That's one agent for every 70,000 people. Also, that because they were so poorly paid, they were very open then to bribes and corruption. Lots of speakeasies would actually give them bribes, would pay them money to try to not prosecute them, and this did help an awful lot of policemen in terms of topping up their wages. There was corruption, though, at the very, very top of American society as well too, right up to the White House. President Harding was well known for having a poker cabinet twice a week, and that was very well stocked with bootleg whiskey. He handed out lots of positions to his friends as well too. This is called the Ohio Gang, and some of those openly undermined Prohibition. They didn't believe in it, and they started to make money from Prohibition itself. Thirdly, you would actually have a massive increase in organised crime. Because you have introduced Prohibition, it makes it very, very lucrative to actually be able to supply alcohol, and you had huge crime networks blossoming throughout the United States. Billions of dollars were made through smuggling, production, corruption, and racketeering. Racketeering is, be able to threaten people with violence if they don't pay up. So these big crime networks started to take over lots of American cities, and each city seemed to have its own crime lord as well too. So you'd have the likes of Al Capone in Chicago. You'd have very, very famous bosses, mafia bosses that would control large amounts of wealth, a lot of it through supplying alcohol. That would actually go all the way up to corruption in the police, keeping people on side, and even up to political authority too, which a lot of the gangsters would be involved in paying them off too. So there'd be lots of turf wars around Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. Lucky Luciano would be involved in New York, Al Capone in Chicago. It's estimated that Al Capone himself was making $1,500 a minute in 1928. A very brutal man as well too. He was called Scarface, and he had a gang of torpedoes, murder squads that were sent across America to be able to kill people that he didn't like. A very famous example of this is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where he killed 7 rival members in a crime which was plastered across the front pages of American newspapers. Okay, it was estimated that up to half of the Chicago police officers were meant to be on the take, taking bribes from Al Capone as well too. So these types of reasons would actually certainly have led to Prohibition being undermined. There was also mounting opposition to it as well too. So you would actually have lots of business groups. You'd have women's groups as well, who really did see why Prohibition was failing, and were determined to reverse the amendment to introduce Prohibition. You had the people arguing the tax as well too was being lost. The crime was expanding, and they wanted to make America a better place, and they thought that Prohibition had certainly not lived up to its idea of the Noble Experiment. So hopefully these ideas here will actually try to explain why Prohibition was in the end reversed. Thanks very much for listening.